Jake Martinez wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag, the familiar smell of engine oil filling his small repair shop on the outer rim of Titan Station. The mining colony wasn't much to look at, just a collection of prefab buildings and maintenance bays scattered across the moon's frozen surface. But it was home. Most folks here worked the methane processors or hauled ice from the deeper caverns. Jake fixed their equipment when it broke down, which was pretty much every day. The communication panel crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. "Jake, you there?" It was Captain Rodriguez from the patrol division. "Yeah, what's up, Maria?" Jake set down his tools and walked over to the comm unit. "Got a situation about 2 clicks north of your position. Some kind of ship went down in the ice fields. Looks alien, but it's not responding to our signals. Command wants you to take a look at it before we send in the recovery team." Jake raised an eyebrow. Alien ships weren't exactly common around these parts. Sure, there were a few trading posts where different species met to exchange goods, but most aliens kept to their own territories. "Any idea what species we're dealing with?" "Negative. Ship's design doesn't match anything in our databases. You still got that portable scanner I lent you last month?" "Yeah, it's here somewhere." Jake rummaged through a toolbox until he found the military-grade scanning device. "I'll head out in about 20 minutes. Send me the coordinates." The ride to the crash site took longer than expected. Jake's maintenance crawler moved slowly across the uneven ice, its treads crunching through the crystallized methane that covered most of Titan's surface. The sun was just a distant point of light, barely providing any warmth through the thick atmosphere. He'd made this journey countless times to repair mining equipment, but something felt different today. When he finally reached the coordinates, Jake couldn't help but whistle under his breath. The ship was beautiful, even crashed and partially buried in the ice. It looked like someone had carved it from a single piece of dark metal with smooth curves that seemed to flow like water. There were no visible seams or joints anywhere on the hull. Whatever technology had built this thing was far beyond human understanding. Jake parked his crawler and suited up. The atmosphere on Titan wasn't breathable for humans, so he pulled on his environmental suit and checked the seals twice. The scanner hung from his belt, beeping softly as it detected the alien vessel's energy signature. As he approached the ship, Jake noticed something odd. There was a hole in the side of the hull, but it wasn't from the crash. The edges were too clean, too precise. Someone or something had cut through the metal from the inside. "This just gets better and better," Jake muttered to himself. He activated his helmet's recording system and began walking around the perimeter of the ship. The scanner showed that most of the vessel's systems were offline, but there were still some faint power readings coming from what looked like the rear section. That's when he heard it. A low, keening sound that seemed to vibrate through the ice itself. It wasn't mechanical, it was organic. Jake froze, his hand moving instinctively to the plasma cutter on his tool belt. The sound came again, weaker this time, almost like a whimper. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the hole in the ship's hull. The interior was dark, lit only by the beam from his helmet lamp. The walls were covered in symbols that looked like flowing script, and the air had a strange, sweet smell that his suit's filters couldn't quite eliminate. Jake moved carefully through what appeared to be a corridor, following the periodic sounds. He found the source in what might have been a cargo hold. At first, Jake thought it was some kind of large cat, maybe a snow leopard that had somehow gotten aboard the alien ship. But as his light played across the creature, he realized he was looking at something far more exotic. The being was roughly the size of a large dog, with fur that was so white it almost seemed to glow in the darkness. But this wasn't earth white. This was something else entirely, like looking at fresh snow under starlight. The creature's eyes were a pale blue that seemed to shift and change as Jake watched. Most striking of all were the faint patterns visible beneath the fur, geometric shapes that pulsed with a very subtle bioluminescence. The creature was lying on its side, and Jake could see that one of its rear legs was badly injured. Dark fluid that might have been blood had pooled beneath the limb, and the being's breathing was shallow and rapid. "Well, aren't you something special?" Jake said softly, keeping his distance. He'd heard stories about first contact protocols, but nobody had ever explained what to do when you found an injured alien that looked like a mythical Earth animal. The creature's head turned toward him, and those strange eyes fixed on his helmet. For a moment, Jake felt like he was being evaluated, studied with an intelligence that was definitely not animal-like. Then the being made that soft, keening sound again, and Jake's heart clenched. He activated his comm unit. "Maria, you there?" "Copy, Jake. What's your status?" "I found a survivor. Looks injured. I'm going to need medical supplies and probably Dr. Chen if she's available." "A survivor? What species are we dealing with?" Jake looked at the wounded creature again. "I honestly have no idea, but it's hurt, and I'm not leaving it here to die." There was a pause on the other end of the comm. "Jake, you know the regulations about first contact. We're supposed to wait for the xenobiology team. How long would that take?" "Probably 6 to 8 hours, depending on when the next transport arrives from Earth Station." Jake looked at the creature again. Its breathing was getting more labored, and the bioluminescent patterns under its fur were flickering weakly. "It doesn't have 6 hours, Maria. I'm bringing it back with me." "Jake, wait. You can't just—" He switched off the comm and looked at the injured being. "Okay, friend. I don't know if you can understand me, but I'm going to try to help you. Just don't bite me, okay?" Moving slowly and keeping his hands visible, Jake approached the creature. It watched him warily, but didn't try to move away. When he got within arm's reach, Jake carefully examined the injured leg. It looked like it had been caught in some kind of machinery, probably during the crash. The bone wasn't broken, but there was significant tissue damage. Jake pulled an emergency medical kit from his suit's utility pouch. It wasn't designed for alien physiology, but trauma was trauma. He activated a pain suppressor gel and carefully applied it to the wound area. The creature tensed at first, then seemed to relax as the medication took effect. "That's it. Easy does it," Jake murmured, working as gently as possible. He cleaned the wound with an antiseptic solution and wrapped it with a flexible bandage that would adapt to the being's movements. When he was finished, Jake sat back on his heels and looked at the creature. "I wish I could ask you what happened here. Where did you come from? Are there others like you?" As if responding to his questions, the being made a series of soft, chirping sounds. The patterns under its fur pulsed in what might have been a rhythm or code. Jake felt like he was missing something important, some form of communication he didn't understand. He made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Carefully, Jake scooped the creature up in his arms. It was heavier than he'd expected, with dense muscle beneath the silky fur, but it didn't struggle. If anything, it seemed to settle against him with what might have been relief. The journey back to his shop was nerve-wracking. Jake kept expecting security patrols to intercept him, demanding explanations he didn't have, but the comm channels stayed quiet, and he made it to his maintenance bay without incident. Once inside, Jake set up a makeshift bed using some old thermal blankets and placed the creature on it. Under the bright workshop lights, he could see details he'd missed in the ship. The being's fur had an almost crystalline structure, and those bioluminescent patterns were even more complex than he'd thought. They seemed to respond to the creature's emotional state, brightening when it was alert and dimming when it rested. Jake pulled up a chair and sat down beside his unexpected guest. "So what am I supposed to call you?" he asked, knowing he wouldn't get an answer. "You look like some kind of big cat, but those markings are definitely not natural evolution." The creature turned its head toward him and made a soft, trilling sound. Then, to Jake's amazement, it raised one paw and gently touched his arm. Even through his work clothes, he could feel warmth radiating from the contact. "I think you're trying to tell me something," Jake said. But I'm just a grease monkey from Titan Station. I fix engines and life support systems. I don't speak alien. Over the next few hours, Jake did his best to make the creature comfortable. He rigged up a water dispenser and tried offering various food supplies from his emergency rations. The being showed some interest in the protein bars, but seemed more satisfied with the clean water. As evening approached, or what passed for evening on a moon, where the sun was always just a distant star, Jake realized he was facing a serious problem. He couldn't keep this creature hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone would come asking questions about the crash site and what he'd found there. But looking at the injured being resting peacefully on the improvised bed, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it deserved a chance to heal and survive. And maybe, just maybe, he'd stumbled onto something that would change humanity's understanding of what was possible in the galaxy. The creature's eyes opened and fixed on his face again. Those pale blue orbs seemed to hold depths of intelligence and emotion that Jake was only beginning to comprehend. For the first time since finding the crashed ship, he wondered if he was the one being rescued. 3 weeks had passed since Jake brought the creature back to his workshop, and their daily routine had settled into something surprisingly comfortable. Every morning, Jake would check on his patient's leg, which was healing remarkably fast. The being, which Jake had started calling Snow due to its pristine white fur, had proven to be far more intelligent than any Earth animal. Snow had learned to respond to basic human gestures within days. When Jake pointed at something, the creature would look in that direction. When he held up tools, Snow would make different sounds that seemed to indicate approval or concern. Most remarkably, the bioluminescent patterns under Snow's fur had begun changing in response to Jake's emotions. When the mechanic was happy, the patterns glowed a warm golden color. When he was worried or stressed, they shifted to cooler blues and purples. "You're reading my mood, aren't you?" Jake asked one morning as he prepared breakfast. He'd discovered that Snow enjoyed a mixture of processed protein and some of the hydroponic vegetables from the station's growing chambers. Snow chirped softly, and the patterns under his fur shifted to that warm golden hue. Over the weeks, Jake had begun to suspect that the creature could understand human speech far better than any normal animal should. The morning routine was interrupted by a sharp knock on the workshop door. Jake froze, a spoonful of protein mixture halfway to Snow's feeding dish. They'd managed to avoid detection so far, but Jake knew their luck wouldn't last forever. "Jake? You in there?" It was Captain Rodriguez again, but her voice sounded different, more official. "Just a minute," Jake called out. He looked at Snow, who had already moved to the hiding spot they'd established behind a large equipment cabinet. The creature seemed to understand the need for secrecy. Jake opened the door to find Maria standing there with 2 other people he didn't recognize. Both were wearing the dark blue uniforms of colonial administration, and neither looked particularly friendly. "Morning, Maria. What can I do for you?" "These are Administrators Chen and Williams from Earth Station. They need to ask you some questions about the crashed vessel you investigated 3 weeks ago." Administrator Chen stepped forward. He was a thin man with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Jake's workshop. "Mr. Martinez, we understand you were the first person to examine the alien vessel that crashed in Sector 7. That's right. I sent in my report to Captain Rodriguez the same day. Yes, we've read your report. Very thorough. However, there are some discrepancies we need to discuss." Chen consulted a datapad. "According to your scanner logs, the ship's biosensors detected at least 1 life form aboard the vessel. Yet your report makes no mention of finding any survivors." Jake kept his expression neutral, but inside his heart was racing. "The biosensors probably picked up residual organic material. You know how sensitive those military scanners are." Administrator Williams spoke up. She was a heavy-set woman with graying hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every lie in the book. "Mr. Martinez, falsifying a first contact report is a serious offense. If you're hiding something from us, it would be much better to come clean now." "I'm not hiding anything. I investigated the ship, found it empty except for some equipment damage, and filed my report. That's all there is to it." Chen and Williams exchanged a look. "Mr. Martinez, we'd like permission to search your workshop and living quarters. Purely routine, of course." Jake's blood went cold. Snow was hidden behind the equipment cabinet, but a thorough search would definitely find him. "Do you have a warrant?" "We don't need one. Colonial administration protocols give us broad authority in matters of potential alien contact." Chen's smile was unpleasant. "Of course, if you'd prefer to wait while we get the paperwork from Earth Station, that would take several days, during which time this facility would be under security lockdown." Jake realized he was trapped. If he refused the search, they'd know he was hiding something. If he allowed it, they'd find Snow. Neither option was good, but at least with a search, he might be able to create some kind of distraction. "Fine, but I've got delicate equipment in here, so be careful." The administrators entered the workshop and began a systematic examination of every corner. Jake watched nervously as they moved closer to Snow's hiding place. Behind the cabinet, he could hear very faint sounds that might have been the creature shifting position. Williams was examining Jake's tool collection when her scanner began beeping rapidly. "Administrator Chen, I'm getting readings over here." Chen hurried over with his own scanning device. "Definitely organic material. Recent, within the last few weeks." He looked at Jake suspiciously. "Mr. Martinez, what exactly do you keep behind this cabinet?" Before Jake could answer, there was a loud crash from the workshop's storage area. One of the equipment racks had apparently fallen over, scattering tools and spare parts across the floor. "What the hell was that?" Williams demanded. Jake shrugged, trying to look annoyed rather than relieved. "Probably that old rack finally giving way. I've been meaning to fix it for months." While the administrators investigated the fallen equipment, Jake caught a glimpse of white fur disappearing through a ventilation grate near the floor. Snow had somehow managed to escape through the workshop's air circulation system. The search continued for another hour, but the administrators found nothing more suspicious than some slightly unusual organic residues that Jake attributed to exotic lubricants he used on alien-manufactured equipment. "We'll be keeping an eye on this situation, Mr. Martinez," Chen warned as they prepared to leave. "If you're contacted by any non-human entities, you're required by law to report it immediately." After they left, Jake waited a full 10 minutes before calling out softly, "Snow? You can come out now. They're gone." A few minutes later, Snow emerged from behind another piece of equipment, looking remarkably pleased with himself. The patterns under his fur were glowing that warm golden color again. "You clever little guy," Jake said admiringly. "How did you know to hide in the ventilation system?" Snow chirped and touched Jake's arm with his paw. Then he did something that made Jake's eyes widen in surprise. Using one claw, Snow began scratching symbols into the metal surface of a workbench. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, purposeful marks that formed complex geometric patterns. Are you trying to write something?" Jake asked in amazement. Snow looked up at him and made a series of soft sounds that almost seemed like speech. Then he returned to his scratching, creating more symbols with increasing confidence. Jake watched in fascination as Snow created what was clearly some form of written language. The symbols were beautiful, flowing designs that seemed to incorporate mathematical principles Jake recognized but couldn't quite grasp. When Snow finished, he touched the symbols with his paw and then pointed at himself. Then he pointed at Jake and chirped questioningly. "You're trying to tell me your name, aren't you?" Jake said slowly. "Your real name." Snow's patterns flared bright gold, and he repeated the gesture more emphatically. Jake studied the symbols. They were too complex for him to pronounce, even if he understood the underlying language. But he could see intelligence in their construction, sophistication that spoke of a highly advanced civilization. "I wish I could say your real name," Jake said apologetically, "but I'm just a human. My mouth probably can't make the right sounds." Snow seemed to understand. He made a soft sound that might have been laughter, then touched Jake's arm again in what was clearly a gesture of affection. Over the next few days, Snow began teaching Jake more about his language and culture. Using scratched symbols and patient repetition, he managed to convey that he was from a star system several hundred light-years away. His people, who Jake began to think of as the luminary due to their bioluminescent abilities, were explorers and scientists. Snow's ship had been damaged in what seemed to be some kind of accident involving a space-time distortion. He'd been unconscious during the crash and had awakened to find his ship's systems failing and his leg injured. "So you really were alone on that ship," Jake said one evening as he watched Snow practice scratching human letters into a metal plate. "Were you on some kind of solo mission?" Snow paused in his writing and looked at Jake with those expressive, pale blue eyes. Then he scratched a single human word into the metal. "Lost." Jake felt his heart clench. "You can't get home, can you?" Snow's patterns dimmed to a deep blue, and he made a soft, mournful sound. Then he scratched another word. "Family." "I'm sorry," Jake said quietly. "I wish there was something I could do." Snow looked at him for a long moment, then scratched one more word. "Friend." The simple gesture hit Jake harder than he'd expected. Here was an intelligent being from a civilization probably thousands of years more advanced than humanity, and he was grateful for the friendship of a simple mechanic from a mining colony. But as Jake looked at Snow's injured leg and thought about the administrators who would certainly return, he realized that friendship might not be enough. They needed a plan, and they needed it soon. Snow seemed to understand Jake's concerns. That night, as they shared dinner in the workshop, Snow began scratching out more symbols. These were different from the others, more complex and detailed. When he finished, he touched the symbols and then pointed toward the ceiling. "Another ship?" Jake asked. "Someone's coming for you?" Snow's patterns brightened hopefully, but then dimmed again as he scratched the word maybe. Jake studied the symbols, trying to understand what Snow was trying to tell him. Then it hit him. "You're not just waiting for rescue, are you? You're trying to signal them yourself." Snow chirped excitedly and pointed at Jake's communication equipment. "You want to use my radio array?" Jake looked at his basic workshop communication setup. "I don't know if it's powerful enough for interstellar signals." But Snow was already moving toward the equipment, his keen intelligence focused on the technical challenge. As Jake watched, he began to understand that his new friend wasn't just a stranded alien. Snow was an engineer, just like him. And together, they might just be able to pull off the impossible. Working with Snow to modify the communication array had been the most challenging and rewarding project of Jake's career. Over the past 2 months, they'd completely rebuilt his simple workshop radio into something that resembled alien technology more than human engineering. Snow's understanding of quantum mechanics and subspace communication was far beyond anything Jake had learned in technical school, but the luminary had an intuitive way of teaching that made complex concepts understandable. Instead of explaining theory, Snow would demonstrate principles using simple materials from the workshop. "So if I understand this right," Jake said one afternoon as they calibrated the modified transmitter, "you're not just sending a signal through normal space. You're folding space-time to create a quantum tunnel." Snow chirped approvingly and scratched a symbol that Jake had learned meant correct. The creature's patterns glowed warm gold as he pointed to a series of calculations they'd worked out together. The math was beautiful, Jake had to admit. Human science had theorized about some of these principles. but Snow's people had turned them into practical technology centuries ago. What amazed Jake most was how willing Snow was to share this knowledge, even though it represented advances that could transform human civilization. "Your people must be pretty trusting to let you hand out secrets like this," Jake commented as he fine-tuned a resonance crystal that Snow had somehow grown using workshop chemicals. Snow paused in his work and looked thoughtful. Then he scratched several words. "Friends help friends." Jake smiled. Over the months they'd worked together, he'd learned that Snow's people valued relationships and cooperation above almost everything else. The idea of keeping knowledge secret to maintain advantage seemed genuinely foreign to them. Their work was interrupted by the familiar sound of someone approaching the workshop. Jake quickly activated the camouflage field they'd rigged to hide their modified equipment. To any casual observer, the workshop would look exactly as it had months ago. Snow vanished into his hiding spot with practiced ease. They'd drilled this routine dozens of times, especially after Administrator Chen had returned twice more with random inspections. Captain Rodriguez entered the workshop, but this time she was alone and looked worried. "Maria?" "What's wrong?" Jake asked. "Jake, I need to talk to you about something, unofficially." She glanced around the workshop. "Are we alone?" "Yeah, it's just me. What's going on?" Maria closed the door and activated a privacy scrambler. "Command has been getting some unusual readings from the deep space monitoring stations, signals that don't match any known technology." Jake tried to keep his expression neutral. "What kind of signals?" "Quantum coherent transmissions using principles our physicists say should be impossible. The analysts think someone's trying to communicate with something outside our solar system." Jake felt his heart racing, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Any idea who's sending them?" "That's what I'm hoping you can help me figure out. The transmission point keeps moving, but the strongest signals seem to originate from somewhere in this sector." Maria studied Jake's face carefully. "Jake, if you know something about this, you need to tell me. Earth Command is talking about bringing in a full investigation team. That means military occupation of this entire station." Jake weighed his options. Maria had been a good friend for years, and she'd always been fair in her dealings with the civilian population. But she was also a colonial administration officer, bound by protocols that might not allow for the kind of flexibility Snow needed. "Maria, hypothetically speaking, if someone found a stranded alien who needed help getting home, what would the official response be?" Maria's eyes widened. "Jake, please tell me you didn't—" "Hypothetically," Jake emphasized. Maria was quiet for a long moment. "Officially, any alien contact has to be reported immediately to Earth Command. The being would be transferred to a containment facility for study and interrogation. Depending on the perceived threat level, it might never be released." "And unofficially?" "Unofficially, I think our first contact protocols are designed more to protect human interests than to consider alien rights." Maria looked directly at Jake. "If I were to find evidence of unauthorized alien contact, I'd be required to act on it. But if I didn't find any evidence—" Jake understood. Maria was giving him a warning and an opportunity. "There's something else you should know," Maria continued. "Those deep space signals? They're being answered. We're detecting response transmissions from outside the solar system. Whatever you're dealing with, Jake, it's bigger than just one stranded being." After Maria left, Jake called Snow out of hiding. The luminary's patterns were flickering nervously between blue and purple. "We're running out of time," Jake said. "Your people are trying to reach you, aren't they?" Snow nodded and quickly scratched symbols. "Rescue ship coming 3 days." 3 days? Jake felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that Snow would finally be reunited with his people, but dread at the thought of losing his extraordinary friend. Snow seemed to sense Jake's conflicted emotions. His patterns shifted to warm gold, and he touched Jake's arm gently. Then he began scratching more symbols. "What are you trying to tell me?" Jake asked. Snow pointed at Jake, then at himself, then scratched a symbol Jake didn't recognize. He repeated the gesture several times before Jake understood. "You're asking me to come with you?" Snow's patterns flared bright with excitement. He quickly scratched more words. "Friend, engineer, welcome." Jake stared at the offer, hardly believing what he was hearing. "Snow, I appreciate the invitation, but I'm just a human. I couldn't survive in your environment." Snow made that sound that Jake had learned was his version of laughter. Then he began drawing what looked like technical schematics. As Jake studied the designs, he realized Snow was showing him some kind of environmental adaptation technology. "Your people can actually modify my biology so I could live on your world?" Snow nodded enthusiastically and scratched. "Easy." Jake sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision. Leave everything he'd ever known to explore the galaxy with an alien civilization that might be centuries ahead of humanity. "I need to think about this," Jake said. Snow's patterns dimmed slightly, but he scratched. "Understand." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and emotional turmoil. Snow worked frantically to complete their communication array, sending detailed coordinates to his rescue ship. Jake found himself torn between the adventure of a lifetime and loyalty to his home. On the final day, as they waited for Snow's people to arrive, Jake made his decision. "I can't leave Titan Station," he said quietly. "This place needs me. The people here depend on me to keep their equipment running." Snow's patterns shifted to deep blue, and Jake could see disappointment in those expressive eyes. But then Snow scratched. "Understand, good friend stays to help others." "But this isn't goodbye," Jake continued. "I want you to take something with you." He handed Snow a data pad containing detailed technical manuals on human engineering and manufacturing. "Maybe your people can learn something from our approaches. And maybe someday, when humanity is ready for real contact." Snow's patterns blazed bright gold as he understood. He quickly scratched his own response, handing Jake a crystalline device no larger than his thumb. "Communication. Always friends." That evening, Snow's rescue ship arrived. Jake watched through his workshop's reinforced window as a vessel that looked like flowing liquid silver descended from the night sky. It was beautiful beyond description, moving with the grace of a living creature rather than a mechanical construct. Several beings that looked similar to Snow emerged from the ship. They were larger than Snow, with more elaborate patterns visible beneath their luminescent fur, but they shared his graceful movements and obvious intelligence. The reunion between Snow and his people was touching to watch. They surrounded him with gentle touches and soft vocalizations, clearly expressing relief and joy at finding him alive and well. Snow led them to Jake's workshop, where he introduced the human who had saved his life. The Luminari examined Jake with obvious curiosity, and one of them made a series of sounds that Jake somehow understood as expressions of gratitude. Snow translated, scratching quickly. "Elder says humans are worthy friends. Will remember kindness." As Snow prepared to leave, he approached Jake one final time. His patterns were cycling through every color Jake had learned to recognize, conveying emotions too complex for simple words. Snow scratched one final message. "Will return someday. Bring friends to meet friends." Jake knelt down and gently touched Snow's head, feeling the warmth and subtle vibration of the bioluminescent patterns beneath the silky fur. "Take care of yourself out there. And remember that you'll always have a home here if you need one." Snow chirped softly and touched the communication device he'd given Jake. Immediately, the crystal began glowing with a warm, familiar light. The Luminari departed as gracefully as they'd arrived, their ship rising into the starlit sky until it vanished among the distant points of light. Jake stood outside his workshop for a long time afterward, holding the communication crystal and thinking about the incredible journey he'd shared with his alien friend. Over the following weeks, Jake returned to his normal routine of maintaining equipment and keeping Titan Station running. But everything felt different now. He had a secret that connected him to the wider galaxy, a friendship that spanned the stars, and knowledge that humanity was not alone in the universe. The communication crystal activated regularly, bringing him messages from Snow about his travels and the wonders he was seeing. In return, Jake shared stories about life on Titan Station and the small daily victories that made human existence meaningful. 3 months after Snow's departure, Jake received an unusual message. Instead of Snow's familiar symbols, the crystal displayed complex mathematical equations that took him hours to decode. When he finally understood what he was looking at, Jake's hands trembled with excitement. Snow's people had found something extraordinary in the deep reaches of space, evidence of an ancient civilization that had once connected dozens of star systems with quantum tunnels, just like the one Snow had taught Jake to build. But more importantly, they'd found indications that this ancient network was still partially functional, and they wanted to invite humanity to help restore it. Jake looked out at the stars visible through his workshop's window and smiled. Snow had been right from the beginning. This wasn't an ending, it was just the start of an adventure that would change everything. Humanity's greatest journey was about to begin, and it had all started with a simple act of kindness toward an injured creature in a crashed ship. Sometimes the most important discoveries came not from grand scientific expeditions, but from one person choosing to help another when it mattered most. As Jake began planning how to share Snow's gift with the right people, scientists and engineers who would understand its implications, he realized that his friend had given humanity something far more valuable than advanced technology. Snow had given them hope, friendship, and proof that the universe was full of beings willing to share knowledge and explore the stars together. For a species that had always wondered if they were alone, that was the greatest gift of all.